It's a delight to be here, and thank you, Luis, for making all of this possible. I have a range of things I'd like to talk about today, and you'll see, I hope, that they are all connected. My title, Losing Touch with Reading, and I mean that both figuratively and literally, from print and screen to audio and AI. Artificial intelligence. Let's start with some old challenges in reading. This is an old cartoon. I'm sorry that it is not very clear, but you see this little child being handed a book, and the child is trying to figure out what is this thing, and he comes up with possible names for it and can't figure out what to do with it, and then tosses it away and sits in front of television. Old challenge. Watch television instead of reading. New challenge. Who is doing the reading? Or should we say, what is doing the reading, in this case, to children? Let me contextualize what I most want to talk about by looking at some trends, and these are English-speaking trends largely, on how much people are or are not reading. You've seen some interesting figures today on what's happening in Spain and some other places. Let me start with the United States. A recent study suggested from 2023 that only 54%, roughly half, of American adults have read one book in the last year. And the criterion there was reading the entire book, not just part of it. In the UK, there's a study that came out about 2 months ago, I think, 3 months ago now, by the Reading Agency, that suggested that among adults, 35% in the UK identified as being lapsed readers. They used to read, but they don't anymore. And of those lapsed readers, what's important is a quarter of them, or 26%, said, the reason I don't read anymore is I'm on social media. Well, social media is a version of reading, but not what is meant by reading something of greater length, including books. You know about the PISA exams given to 15-year-olds via the OECD around the world. And there's some scary statistics on how much the 15-year-olds, when asked, decide they read or they don't read. And the statistic that stuck out for me is how many said, I only read when I have to. And that's 50%. I mean, that's half. That's 49% of all of the students surveyed. Interestingly, when the question was asked roughly 20 years prior, only 36%, roughly a third, said, I only read when I have to. So there's a trend that's not going in the right direction. A study done in the United States by an organization called Common Sense, used to be called Common Sense Media, asked a number of questions of so-called tweens, that is, children between ages 8 and 12, and teenagers, so from 13 to 18 years old, and asked how much are you reading every day and so forth. Teenagers read less than their younger counterparts. That is, the older you get, at least among those childhood years, the less you report reading. And if you say, well, teenagers are busy, they have their social life, they have more homework, they have sports, but they find time, on average, to spend more than 8 hours a day on entertainment screen time. And those figures are now probably 2 or 3 years old, and I shudder to think what they are now. Why read? A question that I'm sure everyone in this audience asks, and they have different ways of answering them. So some of the ways that I'll talk about, you'll say, well, I just heard about those, didn't I? Bear with me, please. I will just talk about the way that I've tried to conceptualize for myself the reasons that people read. I ask, why do people read? Because if we don't have reasons for doing so, then people are pretty smart to spend their time doing something else, whether that's adults or younger children. And I think we have to talk about the motivations for reading if we want to have any hope of trying to nurturing reading in people who are not, or people who are lapsed readers, to say, come back. So I talk about the difference between reading by choice and reading because you're obligated to. So by choice, pleasure reading, escape reading, killing time because you don't want to talk to the person sitting next to you on the bus or whatever, and then personal growth, and I'll come back to these. And then reading by obligation, things for school, things for employment, but also social obligations, such as do you yourself respond to a message, such as an email or an SMS that someone has sent you. And then there are the questions of how the answer to the question of why you read has implications for the medium on which you choose to read and the extent to which you choose to use artificial intelligence in the reading process. Let's talk about medium. Does the medium on which you read matter? And there's a relationship, as I just suggested, to what your goal is in reading. I'll talk about print versus digital, about what I call the magic touch, and then about print versus audio and video. Okay, print versus digital. Most of you probably know the literature. I'll give a really quick summary. Experimental evidence suggests that if you were comparing simply reading a print something, whether it's a book or whether it's a page, versus reading the same material digitally, statistically, there's evidence that there's better comprehension in comprehension tests. There's better comprehension for print. And that's especially true for longer texts. What counts as longer? Some of the studies say over 500 words. That's not very long, but doing these tests, you can't have people read 200 pages, so you take shorter things, but we call them long. And for informational texts, generally speaking, comprehension is greater with print. In the earlier studies that were done, around 2005, 2010, when people were doing much less digital reading, if you ran studies like this, the participants were likely to tell you before they took the test, or even after, I think I did better with print. If you ask that same question today, and studies have been done with middle school students and done with the university students, they will tell you, I'm going to do better with the digital. And then you look at how they did, and they did better, again, statistically, with the print. Oops, I forgot one. Besides these experimental studies, there are perceptual studies where you survey people, sometimes with a questionnaire, sometimes with an interview, and ask, well, tell me more about what your perceptions are about how you read differently in these media. And that's where most of my research has been over the last decade or so, and I'd like to talk about just a little bit of it. I did a study, came out in 2017. The data were collected several years earlier, but I will say before I go further, the more recent studies are showing exactly the same kinds of patterns, so I don't think the data are old in that sense. I had 429 students from 5 different countries, and one of the questions that I asked about reading in print versus digitally is, on what medium do you think you concentrate best? 92% of these were university students, 92% said, I concentrate best in print. And it was Germany that had the highest number of students who said, I concentrate best in print. But I asked other questions. If you're reading a long text, if you're reading a short text, what do you prefer to use? 86% said they prefer print if it's long. I asked about pleasure reading versus reading for school. 78% said they preferred it for pleasure reading. Would that change a little bit now, given how ingrained digital reading has become? Probably, but it's still, I'll bet you, much higher than 50%. The second study that I did with my colleague Anna Mangen in Norway was with secondary school students. We did one study in Stavanger in Norway, and then we did a study in Amsterdam, and that's the one I'm going to talk about. It was with 10 to 17-year-olds. We had a fairly large number of them, 532. We collected the data in fall 2021 and asked them some of the same questions that we had asked the university students a few years prior. But what I'd like to talk about is one question in particular that I asked. What is the one thing you like most about reading in print? We also asked, what do you like most about reading digitally? What do you like least about reading digitally and reading in print? But let me focus on the most about reading in print. Concentration. So a huge number of them said, what I like most about reading in print is, for example, I find it easiest to concentrate. Or relaxing. It makes me feel calm and relaxed. Reality. The realness of the book. And what I found so fascinating is even with the university students and with the middle school and high school students I looked at, so many of them spontaneously said, a book in the print is real. Nobody said reading electronically was real. It was their word. They came up with it independently, spontaneously. Imagination. I find my imagination is far better when I read in print instead of on screen. And I saw a lot of this, particularly with the secondary school students who were reading a lot of fiction or being asked to read fiction, and they would tell you, my mind engages very differently when I'm reading in print. Absorption. You're able to lose yourself in the words, and you can read forever without thinking about anything else. The magic touch. So again, we asked, what is the one thing you like most about reading in print? And a number of them talked about touch, about haptics, which connects with the larger notion in psychology of of embodied cognition, a theory that says we don't just learn things, or at least perceive things to begin with our minds. Our entire body is involved in the process. Among the students, those 532 middle and high school students in Amsterdam, 18% of them, almost 1 out of 5, when asked, what's the one thing you like most about reading in print? Almost 1 out of 5 said what they liked most was something having to do with touch. So they would talk about holding. You can actually feel like you're reading because the book is in your hands. Or the movement, and I like that last slide of the pages turning, yes, from Louise. Turning the pages is satisfying in an inexplicable way. Or other things, cognitive issues. I take it more seriously because it's in my hands. I'll just mention, I also did some studies on people writing by hand versus writing on digital keyboards, and asked, what do you like most about writing by hand as opposed to on digital keyboard, and what like least, and so forth. And many, many people said, I think better when I'm writing by hand. I feel that better, ideas are coming out better. I feel it's mine. And they said various other kinds of things. But a number of them just talked about the hands-on experience of writing, which was totally parallel to the hands-on experience of reading. Emotions. The feeling of a book in my hands is a very comfortable feeling, with personal connection. It's more personal because it's in your hands. Or again, that reality issue. I can feel the actual book. And again, these are school kids. These are younger kids who have this sense of things. These are kids who grew up in a digital environment, but nonetheless, they're telling you how they feel about feeling a book. Print versus audio and video. I've done some work here, and what's pretty interesting is how little research we actually have in either of these categories. But let's first just talk for a moment about the move that's happening from text to audio and video, both in school systems, at least in the United States, and among adults reading. So the number of audiobooks that are being sold or licensed is huge. I mean, it's the biggest growth industry in the book world, at least in the United States, and obviously in some other countries as well. Another thing that's happening, though, besides the growth of podcasts, which is large, is what's going on with newspapers. When I bring out my phone to read the newspaper, which I hate to do, but when I travel, I cannot get the print version of the real New York Times or the Washington Post. And then I'm offered either to have an audio narration, and I really don't want it. I want to read the article, thank you. Or what drives me crazy is the reporter, some really well-known reporters, are narrating their own piece live on video. I don't want to see the video. I just want to read it, thank you. But more and more and more, with newspapers as well as with magazines, you are being given particularly audio versions. And then there's YouTube, and there's video in the news channels. If I want to read on CNN News on my phone, I don't want to see the videos, thank you, just let me read the story, please. Okay, and we know that you can run and read a book, read however you want to see it, an audiobook, and multitask at the same time. The same is true of video. Again, I come back with the medium issue to what are the reading goals. A number of people have debated for particularly the last 10 years or so, is reading an audiobook really reading or not? And to me, the question has to do with what is your goal in reading and how engaged are you, and are you looking for learning? Are you looking for entertainment? Are you looking for escape? And so forth. So if you're reading for engagement, let's be honest, storytelling, audio storytelling, has been around for a very, very, very long time. And it has, if it's well done, been engaging, probably more so for some people than reading in print, where you yawn and you turn the page and you don't remember what you saw before because you weren't particularly engaged. And we know that if you have a good narrator in an audiobook, it can be extremely engaging. If your goal is learning, though, and here's where the limited research is, the research that does exist, particularly for school-age and university students, not for the general public, is that you have a higher degree of learning as measured by a comprehension test with text, whether the text is digital or print, a higher comprehension text level than with either audio or video, and not surprisingly. I've asked, does medium matter? Well, do minds matter? What happens when we rely on someone or something else to read for us? Think of that second slide that I showed you with some version of, call it artificial intelligence, reading to children. The project that I'm working on right now is what is the effect of artificial intelligence on our whole notion of reading. But we have to remember that if you have AI doing reading and synthesizing and summarizing and abstracting and comparing and contrasting for you, that's not the first time this has happened in our reading experience as a society going back. We've had book reviews, which were created in the 18th century as a way of helping you decide, did you want to lay out money? Did you want to buy the book? We have abstracts of articles invented sort of towards the end of the 19th century by the Royal Society of London. So you'd know what's in all those papers that were presented, and you didn't have to read them all yourself if you weren't interested in all of the content. There are plot outlines. There are condensed books. There are, in the United States, and maybe it exists in other languages as well, a digital product called Blinkist, which will give you a 15-minute, it's in Spanish as well? It's in English, okay. You folks are too smart to use Blinkist, except in English. 15-minute version of the book. So all these sorts of things have been around as a way of doing something of our reading for us, so we don't have to do the entire thing ourselves. But the question with generative AI, which does read in a way that I'll describe in a moment, how much do we want the reading to be done for us, and what are the consequences of relying on AI to do so much of our reading for us? All right, so what do I mean when I talk about AI as reader? We're used to thinking about the writing that AI does. So say you put in a prompt to ChatGPT, write me a 500-word essay on such, and the essay comes out. Well, what happened before the words got produced? Well, that bot had to access a large data set by using this large language model in order to generate the response. So what happens is we get writing as really the second step in what was first a version of, and I'm using scare quotes, a version of reading by that bot. And there are really two kinds of reading that I see, and we'll talk about those. One is what I call delivery services, that is producing a summary, a plot outline, a comparison, an analysis, a judgment of some sort. And then there are interactive kinds of AI reading where, and I'll give you examples, the AI is giving you something, and then you, the human, respond, and AI responds back again. And we're not talking just about prompt engineering, we're talking about an interactive process. So delivery service, something new that's come out in the last number of months called books, that's with a plural S, AI. Big ideas made bite-size, and basically it's a kind of version of Blinkist. Here's a short version of tell me what book you'd like. There's a product called SciSpace, which is used more in academic contexts, but probably in the business world as well, which locates articles. That's convenient. It discovers concepts for you, so you don't have to discover the concepts yourself, and it gives you summaries and conclusions. This delivery service is also used an enormous amount in the United States in the job world as a way of deciding who gets selected for an interview. It's being used for college admissions to read through the application materials that students have put together. And we can talk about whether that's a good idea or not. Then there are the interactive versions. There's Book, that's singular Book, AI, which is billed as an educational assistant. And what it does is summarizes and answers questions, and you can have conversation back and forth about a book. And there's a tech journalist named Will Knight who Riley wrote, "Why read books when you can use chatbots to talk to them instead?" Then there's the Khan Academy's product, Khanmigo, which is one of the smarter uses of interactive AI for learning, as far as I'm concerned, where students have to do the reading themselves, and they converse with this Khanmigo product, which is based on GPT-4. It may be 4.0 by now, I don't know. And that is the direction I would like to see AI as reader going. So what are the pros and what are the cons of using this kind of technology? Efficiency. You can expand your reading options. You can get translations, which to me is a godsend because I do not speak enough languages. Personal tutoring. But what are the cons? Well, there's that what I call lure of efficiency. It pulls you into saying, I can save you time. You don't have to do all this work yourself. The same kind of thing that ChatGPT and writing came to be named for. There's automation bias, where we tend to believe, well, if this machine that's had billions of dollars spent on it, machine meaning these large language models, it must know better than I do. Not necessarily. There's the issue of loss of skills, of reducing our own drive and ability to express our own point of view. There's weakening our personal communication, because if we rely on bots, as Microsoft would have us do, to read our email for us and respond for us, that weakens our own social bonds. In the United States, there's a documented epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and that kind of letting somebody else do your answering for you is only going to lead to that. Will it also lessen, will use of AI for reading for us also lessen our motivation to read by choice? And I think it's going to, and I believe it will, but I have zero evidence, an experiment in the wings. And will it curtail our employment, our opportunities for the kind of personal growth that reading has long made possible? And I refer to the German concept of Bildung. Okay, pros and cons for society. We've talked about democracy. I come from the United States, which just had an election. I cannot prove what reading does or does not have as an impact on democracy. We'll talk about that privately. But a pro is access to information, language help, especially if you're not a native speaker of the language in which you are interacting, gathering material, and so forth. The cons are, I think there would be a diminished value placed on the notion of reading, whether it's obligatory reading or by choice. And at least in the United States, there's a weakening of a link between reading and education. The reading being assigned is shorter and shorter. It's segments, not entire books in so many cases. And there's the question of threat to democracy. Faustian bargains. Johann Georg Faust. The legend has it from the early 16th century that Faust made a pact with Mephistopheles, the devil. And what would Faust get? Great powers, knowledge, and earthly pleasures in exchange for later abandoning his soul to the devil. Well, I think we have some Faustian bargains when it comes to reading. And we need to be aware when it comes to medium choices of digital versus print and then audio, of being honest with ourselves about what our goals are in reading. If we listen to a podcast of a lecture and we say, well, I'm going to learn this way, and I can be out running, I can be doing cooking or whatever at the same time I'm learning, it's all fine. Are we really learning as much as we tell ourselves we are? At the same time, we need to know what our strengths and weaknesses are when it comes to reading. There are people who concentrate really well reading digitally. And there are people who don't concentrate at all when reading print. So we can't just assume one medium is going to lean to a particular kind of concentration. I think we need to be especially aware of the commercial pressures to use digital, especially in educational institutions. This is true especially in the United States. There's a big commercial press to use digital text rather than print. It's cheaper. Everybody gets access right away. It's not clear people are learning as much. The mind bargain. We have to recognize that the AI companies are pushing us to use their products, including the products that read for us. They're telling us how good it is, how much time we are going to save. And we have to decide whether that's really true and still maintains our minds. David Brooks is these days a journalist, but he's also a sociologist. He was speaking at a prestigious American college. It was probably Yale or Princeton. He didn't identify, but I know where he goes. And he asked of students who were just about to graduate college from this prestigious place where presumably they read a lot, he asked them, what book has changed your life over the last 4 years, the last 4 years of college? Silence. Finally, one student spoke up and said, you have to understand, we don't read like that. We only sample enough of each book to get through the class. One of the most prestigious universities in the country. Okay, so what's at stake when we lose touch, literal and figurative, with reading? Well, we lose aesthetic pleasure, as I've given you examples from even younger users. We lose our mental and emotional engagement and possibilities for cognitive development and for thinking for ourselves. Sorry to magnify that, I had no choice. And we'll see what happens with democracy. So my final recommendation is to strike your own Faustian bargains with reading medium and with AI. To a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent, you get to make your own decisions. But as fairy tales have taught us, be careful what you wish for. Thank you.